Blackpool Pleasure Beach is one of the most iconic parks we have in the UK. No pun intended, obviously, with the Icon ride. Which ride would you keep and which ones would you get rid of? And this is going to be very difficult as well because there are some real classic historic rides here. But, you know, the park have made some difficult decisions over the years, i.e. the Wild Mouse. What difficult decisions would you make if you were running the park? Let's start off with two of the park's biggest roller coasters. Icon, a fantastic ride. I love it. Double launched Mac coaster ride, which is going to have a little twist for 2022. 100% is staying in my park. Built around the landscape, 100%. And of course the big one, the aerodynamic ride, which is receiving quite a lot of love over the last couple of closed seasons and is being continuously upgraded. 100% keeping in the park. It is an absolute staple of the UK theme parks, and again part of the 1994 wars with Shockwave and Nemesis. I'm keeping the big one in the park. Now, much like some other parks, they do also have a sort of children's themed area in Nickland, and I think it works really, really well. Some of the rides being brought in have been especially themed to that area, with a couple of sort of outside rides brought in as well, like the Nickelodeon Streak or the Blue Flyer, both of which are classics and I would keep at the park. Nickland as a junior I think works really well. It's good to see meet and greets of characters, and it just sort of sits in an area where I don't really see much else going there, to be honest. If I own the park, I'd be keeping it. A couple of the park's smaller rides we would also be keeping. Eddie Stobart, really not that sort of offensive. Great little children's attraction in an area where, again, you're not going to fit much else. Great use of space. I would keep that ride. Along with the carousel down there as well, and the carousel up by the big one. The Dodgems, on the other hand, I'm afraid, are awful. And if I own the park, I think they are not big enough to sort of warrant the queue, if you will. And I know we've agreed some Dodgems at bigger parks, including Thorpe Park in Chessington, but they have a much bigger Dodgem track. I think it works a lot better than what the ones do at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. For me, I'd be ditching them. Now, of course, the park do have a lot of roller coasters. Wooden ones and steel ones, they are some classics in there. Now then, some of them we'd keep, but some of them we're going to ditch. Infusion, I don't think it comes as any shock to anyone that I would ditch this ride. I would ditch it. It's really sort of not restricted in where it is, to a point where they could build anything there of similar size. You could have a nice Eurofighter in there, and it would offer a far better experience than what Infusion does. If it was me, I'd sell that and I'd get something else in its place. A couple of the classic attractions include Steeplechase, which again I think is an absolute staple of the park, and whilst I do think you could get a different kind of ride there, this is the kind of unique experience that I expect from Blackpool Pleasure Beach. That also goes the same with the Revolution, something I would never swap out. I think works so well at the park. And then of course we have some of the park's wooden attractions. Now the Big Dipper, I just think is a lovely wooden roller coaster. It feels like a classic. It rides pretty well for the age, to be honest with you. It's certainly nothing that is back-breaking for me. But that leads me on to probably what you know I'm going to say. Grand National, ditch it. Now, I believe it's a Grade 2 listed building. I don't know what that means in terms of potentially changing it or anything, but for me, the ride is unbearable. I believe it's undergoing some work for 2022, and I'll have to give it a ride again in 2022, but every time I ride it, I just dread it. I dread it. And as an owner of the park, if you've got guests that dread, and it's not just me, riding the ride, I couldn't possibly keep Grand National. I would ditch it. Now, the park is also home to some real retro rides, sort of some dark rides and outdoor rides as well. The Derby Racers, every park should have one. Every park should have one. The throughput on this and the ride experience is amazing. It's definitely something I would keep at the park. Along with exactly the same with the flying machines, for exactly the same reason. You can't underestimate these oldies, and I think they're a great selling point for the park. Alice in Wonderland, the Ghost Train, I would keep them both. The Ghost Train, I was slightly on the fence for, literally through to throughput of it, which can be awful. But I love a good Ghost Train. So if I own the park, I'd want a Ghost Train in the park, and I'd want that one with its history. The same can't be said for the Grand Prix ride, which seemed to be threatened to be closed a few years ago and never actually went anywhere. I think this is an incredible waste of space, this ride, with, again, awful throughput, and would be something, if I own the park, I would ditch. I think there's something better value that could go there. And the same for the Impossible as well. Now, I don't know if they could get anything in the Impossible building. Just think it's a complete waste of time. Doesn't add to your experience of the day. If I owned a park, I'd be ditching it. We have a couple of water rides as well, both of which stay in the park. Valhalla, I can't see this being any worse than what it was when it closed, and it was a fantastic ride when it closed. We're keeping it in our park. As to River Caves, a ride that really sort of highlights the classicness of Blackpool Pleasure Beach, and a ride I would 100% keep. That then leads us on to a couple of thrill rides which the park has. We mentioned Nick Land, so we will mention Airbender just in case. I think that works really well at the park, but mainly we're looking at the other ones. So we're looking at Ice Blast, which I think is brilliant, a real highlight sort of attraction you can see with the big one from the other end of the Blackpool Promenade. I would 100% keep this in the park. Small footprint, does really well. And the other one, of course, is Skyforce. Now, I have to say I was on the fence on Skyforce, and if I hadn't had a good ride on it in 2021, where I got continuous spins, I would have ditched it. But given how it was riding in 2021, and that's what I'm judging it on, I'm keeping Skyforce in the park. And finally, it's going to come as no surprise that Wallace and Gromit is staying in the park. I love Wallace and Gromit. I'm thrilled there's a new film coming out, and I think it will really give the ride a lift as well and a bit more of a highlight. If I owned the park, I'd have Wallace and Gromit everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. We're keeping it. Blackpool Pleasure Beach is a massive attraction. I can't imagine what it would be like running it and making these decisions. But what would you do? If you own Blackpool Pleasure Beach, what would you keep? What would you ditch? Again, this isn't about rethemes. You're taking the ride as they are. Keep or ditch. Thanks for joining us here on UK Theme Parks. The next place we'll be going to is Oakwood in Wales. We'll be giving our opinions on what we keep, what we ditch. We'll see you soon.